As we reflect on this discussion, one question that keeps coming up is why would anyone in present time want to associate with the entities that are described in this discussion from hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago? And so it's something to really entertain. Is there really a connection? And if there is a connection, how do you know the connection is there? If there is no connection, why is this connection sought in the first place? Why are people attempting to associate themselves with these particular identities? One thing that is clear about these identities is that they appear to be associated with what would be considered set priesthoods. Is anyone surprised? No. Okay, and so that's what's really going on. We see these groups, these collectives that in one way or another are entangled with this Set identity. It's very interesting because Set is supposed to be associated with Egypt or Mizraim. However, when we look at it, we see that Set is all over the place. Again, this is this primordial type of dynamic that's going on with Set. And so Set has been around for quite a long time, and you see manifestations of Set in various cultures. Now, in examining some of the identities that have been presented in the discussion, that is a discussion of a discussion, actually, what we see are these entities known as the Magi. Okay. And so we see them represented in the collective of people known as the Chaldeans or the Chaldee, also known as the Chesed or the Kesed in Scripture, and of course related to Zadok, which we've talked about before. Now, all of these entities have something in common, and we're going to talk about what that is. And this goes back to that question about why do individuals or collectives of individuals want to be associated with these historic groups, these magi? The question is there because what seems to be at the heart of this whole magi identity, the magi dynamic, is the God complex. And so what we are looking at historically are these entities who are seeking to be God, seeking to be treated as gods, referenced as gods, revered and worshiped as gods. And so there is, in essence, this attempt to replace God. Now let's talk about where the God complex comes from. So we have these magi, these prophets, prophetess, you even hear about them today. This is basically, in essence, the narcissist. And so that's what we are talking about. We are talking about narcissistic dynamics that are being couched in terms of priesthood, in terms of being magi, in terms of being those special, anointed, exalted ones. When we're talking about the God complex or the narcissist, because essentially there is no one with a God complex that does not have pathologically narcissistic tendencies. And so when we are talking about this God complex and we are talking about these magi, we are talking about these entities that essentially have gone around the world taking things from people. What's going on with this God complex is a superiority complex. These are individuals and collectives of individuals that see themselves as infallible, or at least that's the way they want to present. They also feel very entitled, and so that's where you see this dynamic with colonization, where entities go around the world renaming places, renaming people, appropriating cultures, all of that weird stuff, because they believe that they are entitled to these things. They are entitled to the possessions of others. You see this consistently with these Abrahamic narratives. So they believe they are deserving of special attention. They are deserving of special privileges. They also envision themselves or present themselves as omnipotent, all powerful. So there's a big focus on power and might. And again, this is tracing right back to Set and this dynamic of being almighty, Shaddai. Okay. Now, all of this is going on with entities that have these God complex dynamics. But what you also see with the God complex is infantile narcissism. Okay, so individuals may present as all powerful or project that sort of thing, but underneath all of this is low self esteem and, very important, poor boundaries. There's a difficult time with understanding where self begins and where self ends and where others begin and where others end. And so, therefore, there is a lack of respect of boundaries, a lack of respect for things that might belong to other people. And so you see this sort of going around the world again, taking things that belong to others, renaming things, giving things the name of the self. You saw these instances where things would be New Zealand, New York, New Orleans. Okay, so there was this repeated dynamic of doing this and creating these very bizarre and fluid boundaries associated with self and other. And what is being described essentially is psychopathy. You see these descriptions of Machiavellianism. You see that with Set, that entity known as Set. He's probably the original Machiavelli, okay? And so with this God complex dynamic, this royal priesthood dynamic, this God complex situation, what we see is historically this psychopathic pattern, this Machiavellian type of pattern. And when things get really bad, which we've seen them become, we saw that with colonization. We saw that with enslaving people. We saw this with the renaming of places. We saw this with the taking of land. We saw this with the removals. And these removals didn't just start in the Americas. You saw the removals starting also in Europe. You saw these removals in Africa. You saw these removals in New Zealand. You saw these removals in Australia. You saw these removals in the islands. Sometimes people forget that there were indigenous people in the islands before these brown people arrived in the islands with an identity we've been told has been a slave identity. However, it's very interesting that the entities that were the purported slaveholders seem to have disappeared. And so it looks like something else was going on even in the islands that we are not completely clear about. But at any rate, what we have is a great deal of psychopathy going on historically, and that is also involving a significant amount of Machiavellianism again. And when it gets really bad, it gets into that dark triad area. And so these are two constructs I would like for you to look up. We can talk about them also. But essentially, this is what we are talking about. This is what was manifested historically. What's odd, again, is that anyone would want to associate themselves with these identities, take on these identities. But again, perhaps it is because there is continuing narcissism going on. And so sometimes people like notoriety, even if it's bad notoriety. So we have these dark triad dynamics, And then with some of the sadism, which is tied to the name Set again, with some of these sadistic dynamics, we have this additional element of the dark tetrad. And so, again, we are talking about this God complex dynamic, and there are a lot of very ugly things that go along with individuals and collectives wanting to be God, playing God, fantasizing about being like God. And you see a number of entities in Scripture that are referred to as either like God or wanting to rule with God or rule as God. You see this starting in Genesis, and then you see another manifestation of it very clearly in the book of Revelation. And so there is this theme running through some human individuals, this fantasy about being God. We also note in the discussion of the discussion is that there is a referencing of an entity that, in terms of the name, is one of Abraham's nephews. Yes, here we go with another one of these Abraham's nephews. And what we're going to see ultimately is there are two main geographic areas that appear to be named associated with relatives of Abraham. We're going to look at this particular name because this is the name that is associated with the Chaldeans. Now, if you look at Genesis 22:22, you will see the entry that is describing the children of Abraham's brother. It looks like it's pronounced Nahor, but it's Nachor. It's very interesting how all of these names are spelled one way and pronounced another way. At any rate, Abraham has a nephew named Chesed or Kesed. And there's some game playing with that name also, and we can look at that later. But this word Kesed, or this name Kesed, is also the name for Chaldee. Sometimes you'll see Chaldoo. You see all of these variations, these transliterations. But this Kesed is the root for Chaldee or Chaldeans. And it comes before these discussions of the Chaldeans in terms of the etymology. And so the Chaldeans appear to be coming out of this name, which is just interesting in terms of the historic narrative. It doesn't fit that this name, this nephew name, would be coming first because Abraham or Abram is supposed to be coming out of this of Chaldean space. And so it's just interesting that the root of all of this is the name of his nephew. And so the name of the nephew is essentially Chaldee, this Kesed. And then we see another interesting notation where Kesed pops up again with some confusing dynamics going on. And the dynamics appear to be intentional because of the use of these letters. And here you can see that confusing dynamic with that Kesed. So you see this spelling, this Kesed spelling, and there's quite a bit of playing around with this spelling that creates quite a bit of confusion so that it appears that this is talking about a different type of Kesed. It's the same Kesed. There's just a playing around with those two letters, that Semak and that Shin or Sin letter. And so those letters are interchangeable. And so it looks like when Set is being hidden, Set is hidden in this particular letter that replaces that Sin letter, but they have the same pronunciation. Okay, so let's jump into this whole dynamic of this word or this construct of more. What is being asserted, it appears, is that this was a collective of entities understood as magi. That's why the skin color is sort of a distraction from what was really going on. And so the individuals didn't always look a particular way. That again was a distraction. And so when we look in Strong's, we see this construct of magos, and it comes up in both the Greek and the Hebrew. So now we're looking at the Greek, and this is that magian or magian. And when you look at the discussion in the book of Daniel about the Chaldeans, you see that there is this referencing of these entities that are considered magi. And so a magi, according to Strong's and other sources, is basically an astrologer, okay? By implication, a magician, a sorcerer, a wizard, okay? So the individuals who were coming over with Columbus, the individuals who were involved in the slave trade, the individuals who were involved in going all around the world colonizing, they were essentially these magos, magians, magi, and they were considered oriental. If you remember the song, "We Three Kings of Orient Are," this is what is being referenced, is this Strong's 3097, this magos or magi. Now, in some ways, these entities are tribal. Okay, so they are identified as tribes. However, they may not always be biological tribes across the globe. These are entities that are tribes or caste in different cultures. And so you see these magi in different cultures, but they have an origin, according to many narratives, in a particular area, and that's Persia historically. And so they were considered a sacred caste, a part of the Persian religion. And this sacred caste, like the Brahmins, this sacred caste, they were a caste of wizards or sorcerers. And so, again, there is this desire to have supernatural power or a professing of supernatural power, supernatural, beyond what is natural, beyond what average human beings have the power to do. Again, this God complex dynamic, this special VIP type of dynamic. These would be the Levites. And the Levites were involved in some very odd dynamics also. And we've also talked about Zadok, the priest king. And so those entities would all fit under this idea of this sacred priest caste, these priesthoods. What's also interesting about this is this ties into this whole thing, the collectives over on the west coast of Africa known as the Igbo and those known as the Yoruba. Both of those in different ways profess an identity that is tied to this particular part of the world. Okay. So we have these magos, magi, that are also rooted in this construct of Rab Mag or Rab Maj. And you might remember this is about being great. We'll look at that again. So there's this idea of greatness. Again, this stuff is narcissistic. Some people might say it's a part of, various cultures. However, in current times, it's considered narcissism. Okay. And so you have the Magian, the astrologers, the magician, magi. Again, this is how it is referenced in scripture. And you might want to look at the book of Daniel, where you can see more of the narrative about the Magi, about the Chaldeans, about how Daniel also is one of these entities. And so Daniel is manifesting gifts, if you will, in the same way that these other magi are manifesting, and these other sorcerers, these other wizards. Now, if you hear individuals talk about it who embrace this particular spiritual tradition, there will often be an attempt to separate in Daniel from these other types of entities, but they are all the same entities. And so, unless someone has some other analysis that somehow takes Daniel out of this completely, then we basically have all of the same thing: wizardry, sorcery. And here we see this identity was given by the Babylonians, the Chaldeans, the Medes and the Persians, and others to those who are understood as the wise men, again, the wizards, teachers, priests, physicians, astrologers, seers, interpreters of dreams, augurs, soothsayers, and sorcerers, among others. And in the book of Matthew, there is the narrative about the Oriental wise men, also known as astrologers, who followed the star in order to find the Messiah. Now, it's interesting, this focus on this remarkable star, because there is another narrative about these magi that are associated with the Chaldeans that are focused on moon worship. Okay, and so there is a tie-in with all of these entities. And in some instances, the moon worship is about uh, a masculine entity, and in some instances, it appears to be about a feminine entity. And in all instances, it goes right back to Set. When it's all over, it goes right back to Set. And so we also see here that these magi are also associated with the false prophets, the sorcerers. And that's what the Chaldeans were represented as in the book of Daniel. They were represented as false prophets because they were presenting as entities that could prophesy, but when called to task, when it really mattered, they were unable to do so. And here you'll be able to check out some of these transliterations. Now, these transliterations are very interesting because we've talked about some of this before with respect to Irish history. And then we see this Magon, Magi, Magi, Maga, okay, and Magos and Magon, which also is related to that word Mahon or Mahan or Mehun. Okay, so there are a number of transliterations going on there, but they are all related. They are all tied together. And so if you reflect back on some of those conversations, you will remember how they are all tied together. Again, this is this idea of greatness. Okay, this idea of, again, being God like or wanting to be viewed as God like. And again, we come back to that same question: why do individuals need to be seen as God like? Some people are barely making it being human or being man or being woman. But even with the difficulty associated with that, they want to take on something else, which is this God status. They want to rule someone else when they can barely rule themselves. Think about what I'm saying here. Think about entities that have God complexes, and then think about their lives. How well is that going for them? And when you think about how well that's going for them, think about, why would anyone else want these entities to be their gods? And when you look at 7248, you see that Rab Mag, meaning chief soothsayer, an official of the Babylonian king. Again, so this is taking us right back to that Chaldean area. It's important to keep in mind when talking about these Abrahamic dynamics and all of these set dynamics, this Nahor entity is very interesting. The Chaldee word is supposed to be coming from the son of Nahor. Now, this Nahor is presented as Abraham's brother, so Abraham's brother's son. But Abraham's grandfather is also Nahor. And then you have this Terah. So this family seems to be very much involved with idol making, that's Terah or Terah, idol making, and then this being a magi or being a soothsayer. So that's a part of that family's tradition. And you have a number of dynamics going on with this family. Not only do you have this situation with this naming of this Kesed related to Nahor, but you also have it related to Lot. Okay, so when this is all over, this dynamic is also related to the nephew Lot. That whole idea of sorcery is related to Lot. That's a part of Lot's name. And again, remember that there's some indication that Africa is associated with this identity of Lot. And here you can see at the 72:27 mark that this Rab is about abundance, much, many, or great. And now let's come out of Strong's and let's just look at these basic definitions, these basic constructs. And so you have this Magian or Magian or Magi. And so this is related to the Magi of ancient Persia. If you recall, there was a discussion about the Jat Gatras and an indication that the Moor Jat Gatra was not really out of India. There was an assertion that the Moor or Muir Jat Gatra was in the direction of Persia. Okay. And so there was an indication that there was a different origin for this particular family lineage. And it wasn't out of India, as you were seeing so many names coming out of India. And so here we see that the Magi is a member of a hereditary priestly class among the ancient Medes and Persians. Okay, so this is not just the Persians, this is also the Medes. Okay, so you have these entities in Media that are associated with the Magi, and then you have the Persians associated with the Magi. But probably the most important part here, which relates to the original discussion that we are discussing, is that this is a hereditary priestly class. And so it appears to be, just as with the Brahmins, that this is a family ancestral sort of dynamic. And so even though that's what it is, looks like individuals can somehow become one of these entities. And so again, it's identifying this entity, this hereditary priestly class of the ancient Medes and Persians as magicians and sorcerers. What's fascinating is that if you ask people who their fourth or fifth grandparents were in terms of those generations going back, they often can't tell you who these people are. But it's fascinating that you have so many people in current times associating themselves with people that existed, according to the narratives, thousands of years ago. Okay, so it seems impossible to do, but apparently some people believe that they can, or some people are caught up in some very narcissistic dynamics and they don't really care whether or not they are actually related to these entities. They simply want to identify as being related to these entities as a self-esteem dynamic. And so, therefore, they can't really tell you how they are related to these people. It just seems like a convenient thing to be able to do and to identify with. And so, you have many people doing this. But there should be more conversations about how people are identifying themselves as connected with these various groups of people. You see this not only with this particular situation, but with the 12 tribes situation. It's the same dynamic going on, which that's also another collective that in many instances are being referred to as a royal priesthood. And these are just some additional synonyms of this magi or magi. We have charmer, enchanter, voodoo, wizard, necromancer, conjurer, sorcerer, and witch. And here you see the breakdown of sorcerer, a person who claims or is believed to have magic powers. In other words, a wizard, a warlock. And here, when you look at the etymology and you see the Latin, you see this Lot manifestation. And this is the same as the name Lot in Scripture, that Abraham's nephew Lot, this is a part of the meaning of Lot. And so it's this idea of sorting things, casting of lots. So you see that in the Latin, and then it's going into the Old French, into the Middle English, late Middle English, and then we eventually get to where we are. It's also interesting how individuals or collectives of individuals that are of the Abrahamic traditions, there is a high focus on these caste sorts of systems, these social orders. Even when you see what happened between Jacob and Esau, what you saw was a manifestation of caste system, because one entity wanted to be the head. They wanted to be the ruling class in terms of that family, in terms of that social order. That's what that entity wanted. And so that's what was involved in the disguising of oneself in order to present as Esau. Okay, so that entity wanted to be the ruler of the social order. And then when you hear individuals even now talk about those 12 tribes, there's often this excessive focus on being the head. They talk about being the head all the time. There's just an obsession with it. And again, this is narcissistic stuff. People might cast it in, religious terms if they want to. However, in regular terms, it's narcissistic. Even in religious terms, it's narcissistic. And so there is a belief in what's called a respecter of persons. And so they want to be respected based upon being in this social class, being in this hereditary class that's coming from Abraham, coming from Adam. They want to be the rightful heirs of the power. They want to hold that orb and that scepter. Okay, so they are very focused on these class distinctions, and even in some of the class or caste distinctions, you see this extreme focus on gender roles. And so that's where those gender role dynamics are coming from also. There is just an obsession with hierarchy. There is an obsession with power. There's a frequent calling on the Almighty because there's a constant invoking of Set, essentially. And so there is this, again, this extreme focus on division and someone being at the bottom while someone else is at the top. And when we are talking about these priest classes, we are talking about the priest classes being on the top. Because essentially, the priest class is even over the monarchy, because the priest class is the one that's guiding the monarchy. When you saw what was happening in terms of the doctrine of discovery, you saw that Rome was really controlling what was going on with these monarchs. And so Rome, the priest class, was over these monarchs. The priest class, the monarchs already are basically taking things from those below them without working for them. And then the priest class is doing it, all the more. And so there is this extreme focus on getting and taking things that don't belong to a person by virtue of being in this hereditary priest class, in this high class. And then there's this focus on blood purity. So that's what you're dealing with when you start hearing things like blood quantum. What did you hear with Indian removals? Blood quantum, full blood, half blood, quarter blood. I mean, they went through all of these different ridiculous things that the indigenous people were not talking about. So this is something that was brought in by these hereditary priest classes, these nobles, this British nobility, Scots nobility, Irish nobility, apparently Persian nobility, Hindu nobility. So you had nobility coming in from everywhere. The Igbo nobility, the Yoruba nobility, yes, they have been duly noted in this entire dynamic. And another word, if you are looking up this construct, again, we've talked about them before, is the Kohen. Okay. And so you can see them at 3548 in Strong's in the Hebrew. And that word is another word for priest. And this brings us right back to Set with Melchizedek. We talked about that before. We talked about Zadok before. And so this is all in that same line when we are talking about these priest classes. It's also important to point out that in Scripture, you have a number of dynamics where these false prophets are presented. And there are these admonitions indicating that these entities were never called to do anything. And then you also see admonitions, you see warnings about it in the New Testament, that there will be these people that will come, these false prophets will present themselves, and you are to be on the lookout for that. So in other words, these priesthoods, you should be on the lookout for these dynamics emerging and people taking on, again, these God complex dynamics. Because remember, when individuals are presenting as part of a priesthood or they are presenting as these prophets, they are standing in the place of God. So it's a mediating dynamic. They are the media meaning that middle position. They are standing in between the person and the entity that is known as God. And so they are an intermediary. Okay. And so you see these instances where individuals are saying, they are speaking for God as if God has no capacity to communicate. It's a very interesting dynamic. And so you see this over and over and over again throughout Scripture. And of course, you see this over and over again just throughout history with individuals assuming these types of positions. It's a very powerful position because you have individuals who are allowing you to stand in the place of God, to stand in the place of the Creator. And we are talking about humans here. We are talking about men. We're talking about women who have positioned themselves as the voice of God. And here you see this relationship between the Kohen and Jeroboam. And remember, Jeroboam is associated with the Yoruba. That name is associated with Jeroboam. And what is suggested is that the Yoruba and the Igbo were part of some of these entities that were sent forth from the east and from the north, descending onto the west coast of Africa and taking over, essentially, along with some other groups, taking over, from the indigenous people that were there before. But we also see with Jeroboam, there were these priests of the high places. And so this is, again, associated with these priest classes. Now, it's interesting to consider that some entities that identify the 12 tribes as scattered, and then in the Americas, many of them associate their priest class with their priesthood is in Haiti specifically. And so it indicates that these are also individuals who would have been coming out of the Dahomey, Benin area, and presumably are still there. So the priest class would be, theoretically, you would expect them to be still in Benin, in Nigeria. You would expect them to be in Haiti, also adjacent the Dominican Republic. And by extension, you would expect them to be in New Orleans. And so following up, we have additionally this idea of a chief ruler. Okay, so that's what the Kohen is, a chief ruler, the principal officer, the head honcho, in other words. And here you can see some of those transliterations. And these transliterations also look like they are related to Makonnen, the name that is associated with Ras Tafari in terms of Ethiopia. And here are some additional transliterations. Now, before we wrap this up, we're going to quickly look at this other transliteration for Magos, which is Maha or Mahan. Now, there are a few interesting narratives related to this Maha, Mahan, and Maga, and you can see some of them here. What's interesting about this name, this is an actual surname, and we're going to look at the heraldry associated with this name. And it's interesting because the heraldry, the history of the name, it ties to this narrative that is coming from the Mormons related to Cain. It's very interesting how this linkage is there consistent with this surname that's coming out of Ireland. And so you see here that this Maha and this Mahan are both associated with the construct of great. And then you see, consistent with our earlier discussion about the Magi, that Maga is also a witch. Okay, so there's a lot going on here. But it's very interesting how this Mahan or this Mahan, this great dynamic, and the surname Mahan is tied to this narrative about Cain. And we're going to briefly look at this. Now, what you see here is the motto for this surname Mahon, and this also goes along with McMahon. So you see McMahon of Mahon. It's the same thing. Now, what's interesting about this motto translation is that it's using the word RIGHTS when that word is really RITES. And so there's a slight difference there in terms of what is being communicated, but it's supposed to be RITES. And then you can see how it flows when you look at this translation word for word. So when we look at this translation, we see that the motto for Mahon is thus we guard our sacred rights. And again, it's RITES. So it's not rights like rights and privileges, but rights as in religious rights. And here we can see additional transliteration. And so we've broken this down so that we are focusing on the end part here. And this end part is very interesting. Um, it indicates here we protect the sacred. Okay, so the Mahon protects the sacred. The question is, what exactly is the sacred? They protect the rights. So they protect the something related to the religion. And here you can see the heraldry for McMahon, which is the same as Mahon. So you just see these different letter exchanges. And in this case, we're talking about vowels. And then, of course, you have the MAC on the front of it. And when you see the MAC, that's suggesting Scots versus Irish. When you see the MC, as you see in McCarthy, you are looking at Irish for the most part. In this instance, you are looking at Scots for the most part. But at any rate, it indicates here this same motto. Now check this out. So looking at the dictionary of the Scots language, we see this Mahoon. Now, in this instance, Mahoon, and this is going to be consistent with what you see coming from this Mormon narrative. It indicates that Mahoon is a name given to the devil, and so it's another name for the devil. Also used with respect to a mild oath. Now we're going to just quickly look at this Mahon, Mahoon, Maga, Meha. We're going to look at it in relation to this writing by Joseph Smith coming out of the Pearl of Great Price. And so it indicates this is a selection from the revelations, translations, and narrations of Joseph Smith, first prophet, seer, and revelator to the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints. Now, this is about that Cain and Abel narrative. In this particular narrative, coming out of what's identified as the Book of Moses, chapter 5, Cain makes a pact with the Mahoon, according to the Scots language, and makes a pact to do things that Cain shouldn't be doing in order to get gain. And so Cain wants gain. Okay. So this is where you see this Cain attacking the brother. In this narrative, Cain believes he's going to get all of the riches of Abel if he attacks him, if he gets rid of him. He makes this pact according to this narrative. And then once he has done this, he identifies himself as this Mahon. He is the master of this great secret of doing these bad things to get gain. And then there's the narrative that he is glorying in his wickedness, according to this particular narrative. So Cain, according to the narrative, makes this deal with Set. And in essence, what's going on here in this narrative is the same thing that happened with Set, where Set was going to destroy his brother so that he could then have the throne. It's the same dynamic going on here. And of course, we've talked about this before. You see this same dynamic going on throughout scripture over and over and over again. This dynamic wherein the individual who is entitled to something is not going to get something because someone else is going to take it from them. And so you see this here, and you see in this narrative that, according to the narrative, Cain is glorying in this entire dynamic. But what is under this whole thing is that Cain sort of starts his own little priesthood, essentially, a Set priesthood, and that those who come after are a part of this Set priesthood that, according to this, would be headed by Cain, but is essentially headed by Set or headed by Seth. And continuing on, you see these descendants also joining in to this secret, according to this narrative, this sort of Setian dynamic, this secret agreement with Set. And so in this particular instance, you have Lamech joining in. Then you have this Irad also being a part of it. This is that line where you see two entities having offspring with the same names. It's very odd. Now people come up with all sorts of explanations for it, but it's just a very strange dynamic where you have, the same names coming through two different brother lines. And so, according to this Mormon narrative, it indicates that for from the days of Cain, there was a secret combination, and their works were done in the dark, and they knew every man his brother. And so, again, this is a very interesting narrative about this interesting priesthood that is associated with taking things that don't belong to individuals. And again, totally tied into Set, whether we're talking about the Chaldeans or whether we're talking about any number of these other groups, they all seem to find their way back to this Set dynamic or this relationship to Set. And again, the question is, and we're coming right back around to why would individuals want to be associating with these ancient identities? Why is this important in current times? Why would anyone want to be these things? Again, all of this is tied into some sort of narcissistic dynamic and some sort of God complex dynamic. Now, individuals may talk about this until they are blue in the face. There is no, in terms of curing somebody from this, there is no cure for psychopathy. There is no known cure, I'm talking about human cure, for these pathological forms of narcissism. And so when people are caught up in these narcissistic dynamics of wanting to be God, wanting to be treated as God, projecting these God-like dynamics into the context, there's no healing that has been noted or proven for these types of dynamics. And so there's no amount of chastising that's going to go on to make individuals or collectives of individuals stop and say, oh my gosh, that is a bad thing. It's probably not a good thing to want to rule the world. Um, they are not going to come to some sudden insight about how bad that is. Once someone steps over into that arena, they are pretty much there and pretty much digging their heels in about why they should be there. So if you ask someone to really process that whole dynamic in the book of Revelation about being able to rule as God or rule with God or being descended from someone who uh, fought in order to rule as God, they will often dig their heels in, okay, and justify why they should be able to rule with God, rule as God. And there's very little that you might say or anyone might say to shake them from that because they really, really believe that that is their lot in life. As we reflect on this discussion, one question that keeps coming up is why would anyone in present time want to associate with the entities that are described in this discussion from hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago? And so it's something to really entertain. Is there really a connection? And if there is a connection, how do you know the connection is there? If there is no connection, why is this connection sought in the first place? Why are people attempting to associate themselves with these particular identities?